My name is Margaret, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak life could offer. I was wrong. The worst pain came wrapped in a black dress and fake tears, standing over my son's casket. But when my daughter-in-law publicly humiliated me at his funeral, claiming I wasn't real family, I stayed quiet. I had to, because I knew something she didn't know, something that would change everything once the lawyer opened that second will my son had secretly prepared. Sometimes the deepest love shows itself in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes justice comes from beyond the grave. Let me start from the beginning, because every ending has its roots somewhere, and this story's roots go deep into 28 years of trying to love a boy who wasn't mine by blood, but became mine by choice. I was 31 when I met Robert's father, William. Bill was a widower with a 4-year-old son whose mother had died in a car accident. The first time I saw little Robert, he was sitting on Bill's kitchen counter, chocolate ice cream smeared across his face, trying to convince his daddy that breakfast dessert was a perfectly reasonable concept. "Who's the lady, Daddy?" he asked, pointing a sticky finger at me. "This is Margaret," Bill said, lifting the boy down. "She's going to be around a lot more now." Robert looked at me with those serious brown eyes, the same ones that would later look at me with love, frustration, teenage rebellion, and finally, adult gratitude. "Are you going to try to be my mommy?" The question hung in the air like smoke from Bill's morning cigarette. I knelt down to Robert's eye level, my heart already aching for this little boy who'd lost so much so young. "I'd like to be your friend first," I told him. "And maybe someday, if you want, something more. But that's up to you, okay?" He studied my face for what felt like forever, then nodded. "Okay, but I still want ice cream for breakfast sometimes." "Deal," I said, and sealed our first agreement with a handshake that left my palms sticky with chocolate. Bill and I married 6 months later. Robert walked me down the aisle because, as he put it in his 6-year-old wisdom, somebody has to make sure you don't trip in that big white dress. By then, he'd started calling me Mom, not because anyone forced him to, but because it felt natural. When people asked if I had children, I always said yes, one son, Robert. The step part never seemed relevant. I was there for his first day of school, crying harder than he was as he walked into that classroom with his Superman backpack. I was there when he broke his arm falling out of the oak tree in our backyard, holding his other hand while the doctor set the bone. I was there through chicken pox, algebra homework that made us both cry, his first heartbreak with Sarah Mitchell in 10th grade, and his acceptance letter to college. Bill used to joke that Robert was more like me than him. "Kid got your stubborn streak, Maggie," he'd say when Robert would dig his heels in about something. "And your big heart." Maybe that's why it hurt so much when Robert brought Vanessa home for the first time during his junior year at State. I wanted to love her, God knows I tried, but something about her felt calculated. The way she complimented my cooking with just a hint of surprise, as if she hadn't expected a stepmother to be capable of making a decent pot roast. The way she called me Mrs. Henderson, even after I asked her to call me Margaret, or better yet, Mom like Robert did. "She's just nervous," Robert assured me after that first dinner, when I mentioned that Vanessa seemed a little reserved. "She wants to make a good impression." I smiled and nodded because that's what mothers do. We support our children's choices, even when our gut tells us something's wrong. And my gut was practically screaming. But Robert loved her, and she made him happy, and that was enough for me. When they got engaged 2 years later, I threw myself into wedding planning with the enthusiasm of a woman who'd waited 23 years to see her son get married. I helped Vanessa pick out her dress, hosted her bridal shower, and organized the rehearsal dinner. The night before the wedding, Robert came to find me in the kitchen where I was putting finishing touches on the centerpieces. "Mom," he said, using the tone he used as a little boy when he needed to tell me something important. I want you to know how much everything you've done means to me. The wedding, but also everything. All of it. You didn't have to love me the way you did, but you chose to, and that's made all the difference. I was 49 years old and thought I was past the age of crying over my children, but there I was, ugly crying into a bouquet of white roses. You were never a choice, sweetheart, I told him, pulling him into a hug that smelled like his father's aftershave and the baby shampoo I'd used on his hair for years. You were a gift, the greatest gift I ever received. He squeezed me tighter. I love you, Mom, and I promise, marriage isn't going to change that. Vanessa understands how important you are to me. I believed him. God help me, I believed him. The wedding was beautiful. Vanessa looked stunning in her grandmother's vintage lace, and Robert couldn't stop smiling. When the preacher asked who gave the bride away, her father stepped forward. When he asked the same about the groom, Robert looked right at me and Bill. His parents do, I said, my voice carrying across the packed church. That should have been my first clue about how Vanessa really felt about our family dynamic. She didn't look at me when I spoke. She was too busy staring at Robert with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between possessiveness and irritation. The first few years of their marriage were fine, if a little distant. They lived 2 hours away in the city where Robert worked as an engineer, and our visits became fewer and more formal. Sunday dinners turned into holiday obligations. Phone calls from Robert became brief and businesslike. He's just busy, Bill would say when I worried out loud. Young married couples need their space. But I could feel Robert slipping away from us, and I didn't understand why. When I asked him about it directly during one of their rare visits, he just shrugged. Nothing's wrong, Mom. We're just building our own life, you know? Our own traditions. Our own traditions. As if the 24 years of birthdays and Christmases and family vacations we'd shared together were somehow less valid than whatever he and Vanessa were creating together. The distance became a chasm when Bill died suddenly of a heart attack 3 years into Robert and Vanessa's marriage. Robert came to the funeral, of course, but he sat with Vanessa instead of with me. During the service, when I broke down crying, it was my sister who held me, not my son. After the burial, Robert approached me awkwardly, like he wasn't sure what to say. Mom, I'm sorry I couldn't. I wanted to sit with you, but Vanessa. It's okay, I lied, because what else could I say? That I'd spent the worst day of my life feeling like I'd lost both my husband and my son? That I needed him more than I'd ever needed anyone, and he'd chosen his wife's comfort over mine? If you need anything, he continued, anything at all, you just call, okay? I nodded, but we both knew I wouldn't call. Something had shifted between us. Some invisible line had been drawn, and I was on the wrong side of it. The calls became even less frequent after that. Holiday visits turned into holiday phone calls. When they had their first child, Emma, I found out through a text message with a blurry hospital photo. When I asked when I could come meet my granddaughter, Vanessa said they needed time to adjust to being a family of 3. A family of 3. As if I weren't part of Robert's family at all. I tried to be patient. I tried to be understanding. When Emma turned 1 and I wasn't invited to her birthday party, I sent a gift and a card and told myself that little children's parties were for close friends and immediate family anyway. When she turned 2 and I still wasn't invited, I started to understand that in Vanessa's mind, I wasn't immediate family. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was sitting in my empty house, looking at a photo of Robert's graduation day, where he had his arms around both Bill and me, all of us grinning at the camera. The boy who'd once walked me down the aisle, who'd called me Mom for over 20 years, who'd promised that marriage wouldn't change our relationship, That boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd apparently decided that his real family started and ended with his wife and daughter. I could have fought it. I could have demanded to be included, could have shown up uninvited, could have made a scene. But I was raised to believe that love means wanting what's best for the other person, even when it breaks your heart. If Robert was happier keeping me at arm's length, then that's what I would give him. So I stepped back. I stopped calling except for birthdays and holidays. I stopped asking about visits. I threw myself into volunteer work at the church and the local animal shelter, trying to fill the Robert-shaped hole in my life with purpose and service. But I never stopped loving him. I never stopped hoping that someday he'd remember who we used to be to each other. I just never imagined that when that day came, it would be too late. The years passed like a slow hemorrhage, not dramatic enough to call for help, but steady enough to drain the life out of everything I'd held dear. Robert and I settled into a pattern of polite distance that felt like death by 1,000 paper cuts. I get the obligatory Mother's Day card, always signed, Love, Robert, Vanessa, and Emma, in Vanessa's careful handwriting. Christmas gifts would arrive by mail, generic things like candles or gift cards that screamed, I asked my wife to order something for my mother, and this is what she picked. The personal touch, the thought, the love that used to characterize every interaction between Robert and me had been systematically edited out of our relationship, one small omission at a time. The worst part wasn't the distance itself. It was watching Robert pretend that the distance was normal. During our brief phone conversations, he'd sound genuinely confused when I'd ask about visiting. Oh, you know how busy things get, Mom. Emma's got soccer, and Vanessa's been stressed about her promotion at work. Maybe sometime soon, though. Sometime soon became sometime later, which became someday, which became never. I started to understand that I was being managed, handled with the same careful politeness most people reserve for difficult relatives or unwanted salespeople. The son who used to call me just to share a funny story from his day now only called when Vanessa reminded him to, and I could hear the difference. The spontaneity was gone, replaced by the kind of dutiful check-ins that feel more like obligation than affection. When Emma turned 5, I sent her a birthday gift directly to their house, a hand-knitted sweater in her favorite color, purple, along with a book I'd loved reading to Robert at that age. A week later, I got a text from Robert. Thanks for Emma's gift. She loved it. Not Emma wants to call and thank you herself, or she's been wearing the sweater every day, or even, she asked when she gets to see Grandma Margaret again. Just a polite acknowledgement that the transaction had been completed. I started to realize that I was becoming a stranger to my own granddaughter. Emma probably had no real memories of me beyond brief holiday visits where I was introduced as Daddy's mom, a title that felt increasingly hollow as the years wore on. The breaking point came during what would be our last Christmas together as a family, though I didn't know it at the time. Robert and Vanessa had agreed to spend Christmas Eve at my house, a concession that felt more like charity than love, but I was grateful for it anyway. I'd spent weeks preparing, decorating the house the way I used to when Robert was young, making all his favorite foods, wrapping presents with the kind of care that comes from having too much time and not enough opportunities to show love. Emma, now 7, was polite but distant, clinging to her mother's side and speaking in whispers. When I tried to engage her in conversation about school or her friends, she'd look to Vanessa for permission before answering, as if talking to me required adult supervision. Grandma Margaret made cookies just for you, I told Emma, kneeling down to her level with a plate of sugar cookies decorated like snowflakes. Would you like to help me make some hot chocolate to go with them? Emma looked at her mother uncertainly. Mommy, can I? Of course, sweetheart, Vanessa said, but her smile was tight. Just wash your hands first. As Emma went to the bathroom, Vanessa pulled me aside with the kind of fake concern that's somehow worse than outright hostility. "Margaret, I hope it's okay that I brought some of Emma's special cookies from home. She's been having some digestive issues lately, and I'm being careful about what she eats." I looked at the plate of cookies I'd spent hours decorating, cookies made from the same recipe I'd used for Robert's entire childhood, and felt something crack inside my chest. "Of course," I managed to say. "I understand." But I didn't understand. What I understood was that Vanessa had just told me, in the politest possible way, that even my cookies weren't good enough for her daughter. That everything I had to offer, from my cooking to my love to my very presence in their lives, needed to be filtered through her approval first. Robert, oblivious to the exchange, was setting up Emma's new tablet under the Christmas tree, completely absorbed in peeling away the protective film from the screen. "Look at this, Emma," he called out. "Santa really went all out this year." Emma ran over to him, squealing with delight, and for a moment I saw a flash of the little boy Robert used to be, the one who'd get just as excited about giving presents as receiving them. But when Emma turned to show me the tablet, there was no recognition in her eyes, no instinct to share her joy with her grandmother. I was just another adult in the room, politely admiring her gift before she moved on to more important things. We opened presents with the kind of forced cheer that characterizes obligatory family gatherings. Emma was gracious about the gifts I'd gotten her, but she was equally gracious about everything else, including the generic scarf Vanessa had clearly picked up at the last minute from some department store. There was no special excitement for Grandma's gifts, no sense that I held any particular place in her affections. When it came time for dinner, Vanessa made a show of helping me in the kitchen, but her help felt more like supervision. She rearranged the way I'd set the table, adjusted the temperature on the oven, and gently suggested that maybe the gravy was a little too salty. "You know how Robert is about his sodium intake," she said with that same fake concern. "His doctor's been after him to watch it. I've been making Robert's favorite meals for over 20 years, and suddenly I needed a tutorial on what he could and couldn't eat." The message was clear. I was no longer the expert on my own son. That role had been transferred to someone else, someone who actually mattered. During dinner, the conversation was stilted and careful, the kind of polite small talk you'd make with acquaintances you're trying not to offend. Robert asked about my volunteer work at the animal shelter, but when I started to tell a story about a rescue dog I'd been working with, I could see his attention wandering. Emma was fidgeting in her chair, clearly bored by adult conversation, and Vanessa kept checking her phone. "This has been lovely," Vanessa said as soon as the last bite of dessert was finished. "But we should probably get Emma home. It's past her bedtime, and she's got a big day tomorrow with her cousins." Cousins. Vanessa's sister had 3 kids, and Emma spent Christmas Day with them every year, playing and laughing and building the kind of memories I'd once thought I'd get to share with my granddaughter. But I wasn't invited to those celebrations. I was Christmas Eve obligation, not Christmas Day joy. Robert hugged me goodbye at the door, and for just a moment, holding him felt like holding the little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap during Christmas movies. But then he pulled away, and the spell was broken. "Thanks for dinner, Mom," he said. "We'll have to do this again soon." We both knew it was a lie. As I watched their car pull out of my driveway, I understood that I'd just experienced my last Christmas as part of their family. From now on, I'd be lucky to get a phone call. I was right. The next year, they spent Christmas with Vanessa's family in Colorado. The year after that, they took a Christmas cruise. The year after that, Emma had the flu, so they stayed home. There was always a reason, always an excuse, always something more important than spending time with the woman who'd raised Robert from the age of 4. The phone calls became shorter and less frequent. The visits stopped altogether. When Emma turned 10, I sent her a birthday card with a check inside and got a text from Robert 3 weeks later. Emma says thanks for the birthday money. Emma says thanks. Not Emma called to thank you, not Emma wrote you a thank you note, not Emma asked when she could see you again. Just Emma says thanks, like I was some distant relative who'd sent obligatory gift. I started to feel like I was disappearing from their lives in real time, fading away like a photograph left too long in the sun. The woman who'd been Robert's whole world for over 2 decades had been reduced to an occasional text message and a dutiful but distant phone call on Mother's Day. But the worst was yet to come. The worst came on a Tuesday morning in March, when my phone rang at 6:30 a.m. and I heard Robert's voice, thick with tears, saying words that didn't make sense. "Mom, I need to tell you something. I'm sick. I'm really sick." The bottom dropped out of my world. My son, my baby, my boy who'd walked me down the aisle and promised that marriage wouldn't change our relationship, was calling to tell me he was dying. And I was about to learn just how completely I'd been written out of the story of his life. Robert had pancreatic cancer, stage 4, 6 months to live, maybe less. He'd known for 3 months before he told me, 3 months during which he'd been making arrangements and saying goodbyes and preparing for the end. And I'd found out almost by accident, because Vanessa had finally agreed that I should know. "I wanted to tell you sooner," Robert said, his voice breaking, "but Vanessa thought it would be better to wait until we knew more. Until we had a plan. A plan that didn't include me, apparently. While I'd been sending birthday cards and Christmas gifts and holding out hope that someday we'd find our way back to each other, they'd been navigating the biggest crisis of their lives without me. "Can I come see you?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Can I help somehow?" There was a long pause, and I could hear muffled voices in the background. Robert was asking permission. My dying son was asking his wife if his mother could come see him. "Maybe in a few weeks," he finally said. "When things settle down a bit. The treatment schedule is pretty intense right now." But things never settled down. There was always another appointment, another treatment, another reason why it wasn't a good time. I began to understand that Vanessa had no intention of letting me back into their lives, even now. Especially now. This was her time to be the grieving wife, the devoted caregiver, the center of Robert's shrinking world. There was no room for the stepmother who'd loved him first. I tried calling the hospital where he was receiving treatment, but they wouldn't give me any information because I wasn't immediate family. I tried showing up at their house once, but no one answered the door, even though I could see Robert's car in the driveway. I was shut out of my son's dying just as completely as I'd been shut out of his living. The last time I spoke to Robert was 2 weeks before he died. He called me himself, late at night, and his voice was so weak I could barely understand him. "Mom," he whispered, "I need you to know that I love you. I've always loved you. You were the best mother a boy could ask for." I was crying so hard I could barely speak. "I love you too, sweetheart, so much. More than you'll ever know." "I'm sorry," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice too. "I'm sorry for everything. For the distance, for letting things get so messed up. You didn't deserve that." "It's okay, baby," I told him, using the pet name I called him when he was small. "None of that matters now. All that matters is that I love you, and I'm proud of you, and you're going to be okay." "I left you something," he said, his voice fading. In case things don't go the way we hope. Just remember that you were my real mom, okay? You were the one who mattered." I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to keep him on the phone longer, wanted to somehow reach through the miles between us and hold him like I'd held him when he was 4 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. But the line went dead, and that was the last conversation I ever had with my son. Robert died on a Thursday. I found out on Friday when my sister called to tell me she'd seen the obituary in the paper. Vanessa hadn't even bothered to call me herself. I'd learned about my son's death the same way I'd learn about a stranger's passing, through a newspaper announcement. The obituary listed his survivors as his loving wife Vanessa and devoted daughter Emma. It mentioned his father William, who'd preceded him in death. It listed Vanessa's parents and siblings. But there was no mention of me at all. According to his official death notice, Margaret Henderson didn't exist. The woman who'd raised him, loved him, been there for every milestone of his childhood and young adulthood, had been erased from his story as completely as if I'd never existed. I called the funeral home to ask about the arrangements. They told me the viewing was the next day, with the funeral service on Monday. When I asked if I was expected to sit with the family, there was an awkward pause. "I'm sorry," the funeral director said carefully, "but Mrs. Henderson specifically requested that seating be limited to immediate family only. You're welcome to attend, of course, but I wouldn't be sitting in the front row where mothers belong. I wouldn't be receiving condolences as one of his primary mourners. I wouldn't be acknowledged as someone who'd lost a piece of her heart when Robert died." I almost didn't go. The humiliation of being treated like a distant acquaintance at my own son's funeral felt like more than I could bear. But in the end, I couldn't stay away. Whatever Vanessa had done to our relationship, whatever damage had been caused by years of careful exclusion, Robert was still my boy. I needed to say goodbye, even if I had to do it from the back of the room. I wore my best black dress and arrived early, hoping to have a few minutes alone with him before the crowd arrived. But Vanessa was already there, standing beside the casket with Emma, both of them dressed in matching black dresses that looked like they'd been chosen for maximum dramatic effect. When Vanessa saw me, her face hardened. She whispered something to Emma, who looked at me with curious eyes before turning away. "Margaret," Vanessa said, walking over to me with the kind of purposeful stride that meant business. "I'm glad you could make it." She wasn't glad. She was tolerating my presence, allowing me to attend my own son's funeral like she was doing me a favor. "He looks peaceful," I said, nodding toward the casket. It was a stupid thing to say, but what do you say to the woman who'd stolen your son and was now burying him without you? "Yes, he does," Vanessa agreed. "The last few weeks were very difficult, but he's at rest now." The last few weeks. Weeks during which I could have been there, should have been there, would have been there if she'd let me. But she kept me away even then, hoarding his final days like they belonged to her alone. People began arriving, and I watched as Vanessa transformed into the perfect grieving widow. She accepted condolences with just the right mixture of dignity and vulnerability, holding Emma close to her side like a shield against the world's cruelty. Person after person approached her, offering comfort and support, acknowledging her as the primary mourner, the one who'd lost the most. I stood in the back, watching strangers cry over my son, people who'd known him for a few years at work or through Vanessa's social circle. They got to grieve publicly, got to share memories and offer comfort to each other. But I was invisible, the woman in the back who might or might not have known the deceased. When it came time for people to speak, Vanessa stood up first. She talked about Robert's strength during his illness, his love for Emma, his dedication to his family. She painted a picture of a man whose life had begun when he married her, whose greatest accomplishments were being her husband and Emma's father. Robert was a devoted family man, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. Everything he did was for his wife and daughter. We were his whole world, and he was ours. I listened to her erase 24 years of our life together with a few carefully chosen words. In Vanessa's version of Robert's story, I didn't exist. The little boy who'd walked me down the aisle, who'd called me Mom, who'd promised that marriage wouldn't change our relationship. That boy had apparently never existed at all. Several other people spoke. Work colleagues, friends, Vanessa's family members. They all painted the same picture of a man whose real life had started when he met Vanessa, whose only family was the wife and daughter he'd left behind. I kept waiting for someone to mention me, to acknowledge that Robert had been raised by someone else, loved by someone else long before Vanessa entered the picture. But the acknowledgement never came. According to everyone who spoke that day, Robert Henderson had sprung fully formed into existence as Vanessa's husband and Emma's father. When the service ended, people lined up to offer their condolences to the family. I waited until the line thinned out, then approached the front of the room where Vanessa stood with Emma and her parents. "Vanessa," I said quietly, "I just wanted to say that if there's anything I can do to help, anything Emma needs." She looked at me with cool, assessing eyes, as if she were measuring whether I posed any kind of threat to the narrative she'd constructed. "That's very kind of you, Margaret," she said in a voice that carried to the people still lingering nearby. "But we have all the support we need. Robert's real family will take care of everything." Robert's real family. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I felt my face go hot with embarrassment. She'd said it loud enough for everyone to hear, making sure they understood that whatever relationship I'd had with Robert, it wasn't real family. Not the kind that mattered. I looked down at Emma, who was staring at her shoes, and wondered what she'd been told about me. Did she know that I'd been the one to rock her father to sleep when he had nightmares? That I'd taught him to ride a bike and helped him with his homework and held him when his heart was broken? Or had Vanessa convinced her that I was just some woman who'd been married to her grandfather, a stepmother who'd never really mattered? "I understand," I said quietly, because what else could I say? That I'd loved Robert first? That I'd been there for him when she was still in elementary school? That he'd once promised me that marriage wouldn't change our relationship? None of that mattered now. In the end, Vanessa had won. She'd successfully erased me from Robert's story, reduced me to a footnote that didn't even make it into the official record. I was the mother who wasn't a mother, the family member who wasn't family, the woman who'd loved a boy for 28 years only to be written out of his ending. I left the funeral home that day feeling like I was dissolving, disappearing one piece at a time until there would be nothing left of the woman who'd once been Robert's whole world. As I drove home through streets that seemed grayer than they had that morning, I tried to figure out how to live with the weight of loving someone who'd apparently decided I didn't matter. But I was about to learn that Robert's story wasn't over yet. And sometimes, the people who love us find ways to make sure we know it, even from beyond the grave. The lawyer's call came 3 days after the funeral, just as I was trying to figure out how to fill the Robert-shaped hole in my life with something that resembled purpose. I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at a sympathy card from my church ladies group, when the phone rang. "Mrs. Henderson? This is David Morrison from Morrison, Keller and Associates. I was Robert Henderson's attorney, and I need to schedule a meeting with you regarding his estate." I was confused. Robert's estate? Why would Robert's lawyer need to meet with me? Surely everything would go to Vanessa and Emma as it should. I'd been written out of his life so completely that I couldn't imagine I'd been included in his will. "I think there might be some mistake," I said. "I'm Robert's stepmother, but his wife would be the one to handle estate matters." "Ma'am, there's no mistake," Mr. Morrison said gently. "Robert left specific instructions that you be present for the reading of his will. In fact, he was quite insistent about it. Would Friday at 2 o'clock work for you?" I agreed, though I couldn't imagine what Robert might have left me. Maybe some small token, some acknowledgement that I'd once mattered to him. A photo, perhaps, or some piece of furniture from his childhood. I tried not to hope for too much. tried to protect what was left of my heart from one final disappointment. Friday came, and I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Robert's graduation and his wedding and every other important event in his life. If this was going to be my final official act as his mother, I wanted to look the part. Morrison, Keller, and Associates had offices in a glass building downtown, the kind of place that screamed expensive legal services. I felt out of place walking through the marble lobby in my department store suit, but the receptionist was kind and directed me to a conference room on the 15th floor. Vanessa was already there when I arrived, sitting at a long mahogany table with her own lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in a power suit who looked like she could tear apart opposing counsel with her perfectly manicured fingernails. Emma wasn't with them. This was adults-only business. "Margaret," Vanessa said with barely concealed irritation. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Mr. Morrison asked me to come," I said, taking a seat on the opposite side of the table. The distance between us felt symbolic, like we were adversaries preparing for battle rather than two women who'd both loved the same man. David Morrison entered a few minutes later, carrying a thick file and wearing the kind of serious expression that meant business. He was older than I'd expected, maybe 65, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Thank you both for coming," he said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time, and I appreciate your patience with this process." He opened the file and pulled out several documents, arranging them in front of him with the careful precision of someone who'd done this many times before. "Before we begin," he said, looking directly at me, "I want you to know that Robert came to see me about 6 months ago to update his will. He was very specific about his wishes, and he asked me to make sure that both of you understood the reasoning behind his decisions. 6 months ago, right around the time he'd been diagnosed, when he was coming to terms with his mortality and thinking about how he wanted to leave things. I wondered if Vanessa knew he'd been planning for the end so early, if she'd been part of those conversations or if he'd kept them private." "The main provisions of Robert's will are fairly straightforward," Mr. Morrison continued. "The house, the cars, the majority of his financial assets, his life insurance policy, all of these go to his wife Vanessa, with provisions for his daughter Emma's education and future needs." I nodded. This was what I'd expected, what made sense. Robert's first responsibility was to his wife and child, and I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. "However," Mr. Morrison continued, and something in his tone made both Vanessa and me sit up straighter, "Robert also made some additional provisions that he asked me to explain in detail." He pulled out another document, this one sealed in a separate envelope, with my name written on it in Robert's familiar handwriting. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, looking directly at me, "Robert left you his collection of first edition books, his father's watch, and all of the photo albums from his childhood and adolescence. He also left a letter explaining his wishes regarding these items." I felt tears prick at my eyes. The books had been Robert's pride and joy, a collection he'd started in high school and continued building throughout his adult life. His father's watch was a family heirloom that Bill had given him on his 18th birthday. And the photo albums, God, the photo albums contained 24 years of memories, pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and family vacations, visual proof that we'd once been a family. "That's ridiculous," Vanessa said sharply. "Those books are worth thousands of dollars, and that watch is a family heirloom. Emma should have those things, not." She gestured toward me with barely concealed disdain. "Mrs. Henderson," Mr. Morrison said calmly, "your husband's will is quite clear about these provisions. But there's more." He pulled out yet another document, this one thicker than the others, and I could see Vanessa's lawyer leaning forward with interest. "Robert also established a trust fund," Mr. Morrison continued, $50,000 to be used specifically for Emma's relationship with her grandmother Margaret. The funds are to be administered by Mrs. Henderson for the purpose of facilitating visits, vacations, educational opportunities, and other activities that will help maintain and strengthen the bond between Emma and her grandmother. Vanessa's face went white. That's impossible. Robert never mentioned any trust fund. He wouldn't have done that without telling me. Mr. Morrison looked at her with the patient expression of a man who dealt with many shocked beneficiaries over the years. Mrs. Henderson, your husband was very clear about his intentions. He felt strongly that Emma should know her grandmother and understand the role Mrs. Henderson played in his life. She's not Emma's grandmother, Vanessa snapped, her composure finally cracking. She's nothing to us. She's just some woman who married Robert's father. She has no legal relationship to Emma whatsoever. The words hung in the air like poison, and I felt something inside me shrivel up and die. After everything, after 28 years of loving Robert like my own son, this was how his wife saw me. Just some woman. Nothing to them. But Mr. Morrison wasn't finished. Actually, Mrs. Henderson, he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, there's one more document I need to share with you both. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another sealed envelope, this one thicker than the others. Written on the front in Robert's handwriting were the words, "To be opened only in the presence of both Margaret and Vanessa." Robert gave me very specific instructions about this particular document, Mr. Morrison said. He asked me to read it aloud, in its entirety, to both of you together. He opened the envelope and pulled out several pages of Robert's handwriting. Even from across the table, I could see that this wasn't a legal document. This was a letter, written in the same careful script Robert had used for thank-you notes and birthday cards throughout his life. This is a personal letter from Robert to both of you, Mr. Morrison said. He asked me to read it because he wanted to make sure his feelings were clearly understood. He cleared his throat and began to read. To my wife Vanessa and my mother Margaret. If you're hearing this letter, it means I'm gone, and you're both sitting in David Morrison's office trying to figure out what I've done and why I've done it. I'm sorry it has to be this way, but there are things that need to be said that I never had the courage to say while I was alive. I felt my hands start to shake. Robert's voice, speaking to me from beyond the grave, addressing me as his mother in front of the woman who'd spent years denying that relationship. Vanessa, I love you. I've loved you since the day we met, and marrying you was one of the best decisions I ever made. You gave me Emma, and you made me a better man in 1,000 different ways. But you also took something away from me, something I didn't even realize I was losing until it was too late. Mr. Morrison paused, glancing at Vanessa, whose face had gone from white to red and back to white again. You took away my relationship with my mother, not my stepmother, not my father's wife, but my mother. The woman who raised me, who loved me, who was there for every important moment of my childhood and young adulthood until you decided she wasn't welcome anymore. I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as Robert's words washed over me like absolution. He'd known. He'd understood what had happened between us. I know you didn't like sharing me with her. I know you felt threatened by the bond we had, the history we shared. I know you wanted our family to be just us, just you and me and Emma, without any complicated relationships from my past. And I let you have what you wanted because I thought that was what it meant to be a good husband. I thought putting my wife first meant putting my mother last. Vanessa was staring at the table, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. But I was wrong, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry to both of you. Vanessa, I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stand up to you when you started pushing Mom out of our lives. And Mom, I'm sorry I let it happen. I'm sorry I chose peace with my wife over loyalty to the woman who gave me everything. Mr. Morrison turned the page and continued reading. Mom, I need you to know that you were never just my stepmother. From the day you knelt down in Dad's kitchen and asked to be my friend, you were my real mother. You were the one who kissed my scraped knees and helped me with my homework and cheered at my baseball games. You were the one who taught me what unconditional love looked like, what it meant to choose to love someone every single day. I was sobbing now, unable to stop the tears that had been building up for years of rejection and dismissal. When Dad died, I should have been there for you. I should have sat next to you at his funeral and held your hand while we both grieved the man we loved. Instead, I let Vanessa convince me that my loyalty belonged to her first, that my duty was to comfort my wife rather than the woman who'd lost her husband and felt like she was losing her son too. The words were like a knife in my chest, but also like a healing balm. Robert had seen it. He'd understood what his absence had cost me. I've spent the last few months thinking about the man I wanted to be versus the man I actually was. I wanted to be the kind of son who honored the woman who raised him. Instead, I became the kind of man who let his wife erase his mother from his life because it was easier than fighting for what was right. Mr. Morrison looked up from the letter. There's more, he said gently. Robert specifically addresses the trust fund and his wishes for Emma. He continued reading. I've set up the trust fund for Emma not because I don't trust Vanessa to raise her well, but because I want Emma to know the woman who shaped me into the man I became. I want her to hear stories about my childhood, to see the photo albums full of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, to understand that her father was loved long before he met her mother. Vanessa made a choking sound, but Mr. Morrison continued reading without pause. Mom, I'm giving you legal standing to be part of Emma's life because I know Vanessa will try to keep you away from her just like she kept you away from me. The trust fund isn't just money. It's my way of making sure my daughter knows her real grandmother, the woman who taught me what family actually means. I looked across the table at Vanessa, who was staring at the letter like it was a snake that might bite her. And Vanessa, I need you to understand something. You can't erase Margaret from Emma's life the way you erased her from mine. Emma deserves to know where I came from, who raised me, what kind of love shaped me into the father she knew. Margaret isn't a threat to our family. She's part of our family, whether you like it or not. Mr. Morrison turned to the final page. I know this letter will be difficult for both of you to hear. I know it will probably make you angry, Vanessa. And I know it will probably make you cry, Mom. But these are things that needed to be said, things I should have said years ago when I still had the chance to fix what I'd broken. He paused, looking at both of us. I'm not asking you to be best friends. I'm not asking you to pretend that the last 10 years didn't happen the way they happened. But I am asking you to put Emma first, the way I should have put our family first when I was alive. She's the innocent one in all of this. She's the one who deserves to know her grandmother, to hear stories about her father's childhood, to understand that she comes from a long line of people who know how to love unconditionally. Mr. Morrison's voice softened as he read the closing. Mom, thank you for 28 years of unconditional love. Thank you for choosing to be my mother when you didn't have to, for raising me like I was your own, for never making me feel like I was anything less than your real son. You were the best mother a boy could ask for, and I'm sorry it took me dying to find the courage to say so. He folded the letter carefully and set it on the table between us. There's one more thing, he said. Robert also prepared a second will. Vanessa's head snapped up. A second will? What do you mean, a second will? Mr. Morrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out another thick document. Robert executed this will 2 weeks before he died. It supersedes the first will in several important ways. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. What had Robert done? The house, the cars, the life insurance, those provisions remain the same, Mr. Morrison said. Vanessa, you'll still receive the bulk of Robert's estate. But there are additional provisions in this second will that significantly change the distribution of his assets. He opened the document and began reading from what was clearly a formal legal document now, not a personal letter. To my mother, Margaret Henderson, who raised me with love and patience and never once made me feel like anything less than her own son, I leave the sum of $200,000 from my retirement accounts to be used as she sees fit, with my gratitude for a lifetime of unconditional love. $200,000. I felt dizzy. Robert had left me $200,000. But Mr. Morrison wasn't finished. I also leave to Margaret Henderson my half of the vacation cabin in Lake Tahoe, with the understanding that this property will eventually pass to my daughter Emma, but that Margaret will have use of the property for the remainder of her life. The cabin. Robert and Vanessa had bought a cabin at Lake Tahoe 3 years ago, their special retreat, their family getaway. And Robert had left me half of it. Vanessa was on her feet now, her face purple with rage. This is impossible. That cabin is ours. Robert would never have done this without telling me. Mrs. Henderson, her lawyer said sharply, we'll need to examine these documents very carefully. This doesn't sound like something your husband would have done. But Mr. Morrison wasn't intimidated. I can assure you that both wills were executed properly and with Robert's full mental capacity. He came to this office multiple times over the past 6 months, and he was very clear about his intentions. He pulled out another document. In fact, Robert also recorded a video statement explaining his decisions. He asked me to play it only if the second will was contested or if there were questions about his mental state. He set up a small laptop computer on the table and opened a video file. Suddenly, Robert's face filled the screen, thinner than I remembered, marked by illness, but unmistakably my son. If you're watching this, Robert said, his voice weak but clear, it means someone is questioning my decision to provide for my mother Margaret in my will. Let me be very clear. I am of sound mind and body when I'm making this recording. I have not been coerced or influenced by anyone. These are my decisions, made freely and with full understanding of their implications. He paused, coughing slightly, then continued. Vanessa, if you're watching this, I know you're angry. I know you feel betrayed, but you need to understand that Margaret was my mother for 28 years. She deserves to be provided for, and she deserves to have a relationship with Emma. I should have ensured that relationship while I was alive, and I'm trying to fix that mistake now. The Robert on the screen looked directly into the camera, and for a moment it felt like he was looking right at me. Mom, I know this probably seems too little, too late. I know money can't make up for the years I let Vanessa push you away from us. But I want you to be comfortable, and I want you to have a place where you can make memories with Emma if she chooses to visit you. The cabin was always my favorite place. I want it to be yours now too. The video ended, leaving the conference room in absolute silence. Vanessa was the first to speak, her voice shaking with fury. You manipulated him, she said, pointing an accusing finger at me. You got to him somehow during those last few weeks when he was weak and vulnerable. You turned him against his own family. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Morrison said firmly, I need to remind you that everything you're saying is being recorded, and any accusations of undue influence are serious legal matters. Robert prepared these documents over a period of 6 months, while he was undergoing treatment but still mentally competent. I never even saw him those last few weeks, I said quietly. You made sure of that, remember? I was shut out completely. Because you had no right to be there, Vanessa exploded, You weren't his real mother. You were just some woman who married his father. The words echoed in the conference room, and I saw Mr. Morrison's eyebrows raise slightly. He pulled out one more document, this one a single page. Actually, Mrs. Henderson, he said, that brings me to the final provision in Robert's second will. He wanted me to read this part aloud as well. He cleared his throat. To anyone who questions Margaret Henderson's right to be considered my mother, let the record show that she raised me from the age of 4 with more love, patience, and devotion than any child has a right to expect. She was present for every important moment of my life, until I made the mistake of letting my wife convince me that blood was more important than love. She is my mother in every way that matters, and anyone who suggests otherwise doesn't understand what family really means. I was crying again, but this time they were tears of validation, of vindication, of a love that had been denied but never destroyed. Furthermore, Mr. Morrison continued reading, if my wife Vanessa continues to prevent my mother Margaret from having a relationship with my daughter Emma, I direct that the trust fund for Emma's relationship with her grandmother be increased to $100,000, and that Margaret be given legal standing to petition for grandparent visitation rights. Vanessa's lawyer was frantically taking notes now, but Vanessa herself seemed to have run out of words. She was staring at the table, her face pale, as the reality of what Robert had done began to sink in. There's one final video message, Mr. Morrison said. This one is specifically for Emma, to be given to her when she turns 18, regardless of what happens between the adults in her life. He handed me a sealed envelope. Robert asked that you be the one to keep this safe for her. I took the envelope with shaking hands, feeling the weight of my son's final gift to his daughter, and to me. The legal documents will be filed with the court next week, Mr. Morrison said. Mrs. Henderson, Vanessa, you'll each receive copies of everything. If there are any questions or if anyone wishes to contest the will, please contact my office. As we prepared to leave, Vanessa stood up slowly, her face a mask of controlled fury. This isn't over, she said to me. You think you've won something here, but you haven't. Emma is my daughter, and I'll decide who gets to be part of her life. I looked at her across the table, this woman who'd spent 10 years trying to erase me from my son's life, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. No, Vanessa, I said quietly. You don't get to decide anymore. Robert made sure of that. As I walked out of that conference room, carrying copies of documents that proved my son had never stopped loving me, that proved I'd been his mother in every way that mattered, I felt like I could breathe again for the first time in years. The war wasn't over. I knew Vanessa would fight the will, would try to keep Emma away from me, would do everything in her power to maintain the narrative she'd constructed about our family. But she was fighting a battle she'd already lost, because Robert had made sure of that. My son had found a way to give me back my place in his family, even from beyond the grave. He'd made sure I'd be financially secure, made sure I'd have a legal right to know my granddaughter, made sure everyone would understand exactly who I was to him. But more than that, he'd given me something I'd thought was lost forever, proof that I had mattered. That despite the years of distance and rejection, despite Vanessa's campaign to erase me from their lives, despite my own fears that I'd been forgotten, I had been loved. Walking out of that building into the bright afternoon sunlight, I felt something I hadn't felt since Robert was a little boy holding my hand. I felt like his mother again. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and emotional confrontations. Vanessa did try to contest the will, as I'd expected she would. She hired an expensive lawyer who argued that Robert had been mentally compromised by his illness, that he'd been unduly influenced, that the sudden appearance of a second will was evidence of manipulation. But Robert had been thorough. He'd had multiple witnesses, including his oncologist, attest to his mental competency. He recorded several video statements over the course of months, documenting his thought process and his reasons for his decisions. Most importantly, he'd left a paper trail showing that he'd been thinking about these issues long before his final illness, including emails to Mr. Morrison dating back 2 years where he'd expressed concern about my relationship with Emma. The court battle lasted 6 months, and it was brutal. Vanessa's lawyer painted me as a manipulative woman who'd taken advantage of a dying man's emotional vulnerability. They argued that I had no legal right to any inheritance since I wasn't Robert's biological mother, that the trust fund for Emma was an attempt to buy my way into a relationship I had no right to claim. But Robert's letter, read aloud in court, was devastating to their case. His own words, clearly stating that I was his real mother, that he regretted allowing our relationship to deteriorate, that he wanted Emma to know me, carried more weight than any legal argument Vanessa's team could make. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair, seemed particularly moved by Robert's video testimony. When she handed down her ruling, upholding the will in its entirety, she made a statement that I'll never forget. "This court recognizes that families come in many forms," she said. "The relationship between Robert Henderson and Margaret Henderson may not have been created by biology, but it was clearly created by love. The evidence shows a mother-son relationship that lasted nearly 3 decades, and this court will not allow that relationship to be diminished or denied." Vanessa appealed, of course, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. The legal fees were mounting, and the publicity was making her look petty and vindictive. More importantly, Emma was getting older and starting to ask questions about why Daddy's mom wasn't part of their lives anymore. The appeal was denied, and suddenly I found myself in a position I never expected to be in, financially secure, legally recognized as Emma's grandmother, and holding the key to a relationship with my granddaughter that couldn't be taken away from me. The first time Emma came to visit me at the Lake Tahoe cabin, she was 9 years old and deeply suspicious. Vanessa had clearly coached her about what to say and how to behave, but children have a way of seeing through adult politics to the truth underneath. "You're Daddy's mom," Emma said as I showed her around the cabin Robert had loved so much. "Yes, I am," I said simply. "But you're not my real grandma." I knelt down to her level, the same way I knelt down to Robert's level 32 years earlier in Bill's kitchen. "What do you think makes a grandma real?" I asked her. She thought about it seriously, the way children do when they're trying to work out complicated adult concepts. "I guess, loving someone a lot? And taking care of them?" "Then yes," I said. "I'm your real grandma, because I loved your daddy a lot and took care of him for a very long time. And I'd like to love you and take care of you too, if you'll let me." Emma looked around the cabin, taking in the photos of Robert as a child that I'd hung on the walls. The books he'd loved that were now arranged on the shelves, the fishing gear he'd used during our family vacations years ago. "Daddy lived here when he was little?" she asked. "Not lived here exactly," I said, "but we came here every summer when he was growing up. He learned to fish right off that dock, and he caught his first bass when he was about your age. Can you teach me to fish?" And that's how it started. Not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with the 9-year-old girl wanting to learn something her father had learned, wanting to connect with the part of his life that had existed before her mother. Over the next few years, Emma spent 2 weeks every summer with me at the cabin. Vanessa didn't like it, but she couldn't prevent it, and eventually she seemed to realize that fighting it was only making her look bad. Emma would come to me curious and a little guarded, and leave chattering about all the things we'd done together, all the stories I'd told her about her father's childhood. I taught her to fish, the way I'd taught Robert. I told her about the time her father fell out of the boat trying to catch a particularly large bass, and how he'd been more concerned about losing the fish than getting soaked. I showed her the photo albums, pointing out pictures of birthday parties and Christmas mornings and family vacations, helping her understand that her father had been deeply loved long before she was born. But more than that, I got to love her. I got to see Robert's stubborn streak in the way she refused to give up when the fish weren't biting. I got to see his kind heart in the way she worried about a baby bird that had fallen from its nest. I got to see his curiosity in the million questions she asked about everything from why the lake changed colors to how clouds stayed up in the sky. On her 13th birthday, Emma asked me if she could see the video her father had made for her. I'd been waiting for this moment, hoping she'd ask when she was ready rather than trying to decide for her when the time was right. We sat together on the couch in the cabin, the same couch where I'd once read bedtime stories to her father, and I played Robert's final message to his daughter. "Hi, baby girl," Robert said from the screen, his voice soft with love and sadness. "If you're watching this, it means you're old enough to understand some difficult things about our family, and it means I'm not there to explain them to you myself." Emma was crying before he'd finished the first sentence, and I put my arm around her, holding her the way I'd held her father through his own moments of sadness. "I want you to know that you are the greatest gift I ever received," Robert continued. "Being your father was the best thing I ever did, and I hope I was a good enough dad to deserve a daughter like you." He paused, looking directly into the camera with those serious brown eyes that Emma had inherited. "But I also want you to know about the woman sitting next to you right now. Her name is Margaret, but I called her Mom, and she was the most important person in my life until you came along. She loved me when I was difficult to love. She was patient with me when I was learning how to be a good person. And she taught me everything I know about what it means to love someone unconditionally." Emma looked up at me with tear-filled eyes, and I saw recognition there, understanding of something she'd been too young to grasp before. "I made mistakes, Emma," Robert said. "I let your mother convince me to push Mom out of our lives, and I regret that more than anything I've ever done. I should have made sure you knew her from the beginning. I should have made sure you understood that she was your real grandmother, not because of blood or law, but because of love." The video continued for another 10 minutes, with Robert telling Emma stories about his childhood, explaining how I'd shaped him into the man he became, asking her to forgive him for not being strong enough to fix our relationship before it was too late. When it ended, Emma and I sat in silence for a long time, both of us crying, both of us processing the weight of Robert's words. "Mom doesn't like you very much," Emma said finally. "I know," I said, "and I understand why. Sometimes adults have complicated feelings about sharing the people they love. But Daddy wanted me to know you." "Yes, he did. Because you were important to him." "Yes, I was, and he was the most important thing in the world to me." Emma curled up against my side, the way she'd done when she was smaller, and I told her bedtime stories about her father's childhood. "I'm glad he made sure I got to know you," she said. "I'm glad you're my real grandma." And that's when I knew Robert had won. Not the legal battle over money or property, but the battle for something much more important. He'd made sure his daughter would know where she came from, would understand the love that had shaped him, would have a relationship with the woman who'd been his mother for 28 years. Emma is 17 now, and she spends every summer with me at the cabin. She calls me Grandma Maggie, and she tells me about her friends and her dreams and her fears the way teenagers do when they trust someone completely. She's applying to colleges, and she wants to study engineering like her father did. She's kind and stubborn and curious, and I see Robert in her every single day. Vanessa and I have reached a kind of uneasy peace. We're not friends, probably never will be, but we've learned to coexist for Emma's sake. At Emma's high school graduation last month, we sat in the same row and cheered for the same girl, and for a moment I felt like we were what we should have been all along, two women who loved the same child for different reasons. Last week, Emma asked me to help her write her college application essay about the person who'd most influenced her life. She's writing about her father, about the love he showed her and the lessons he taught her, but she's also writing about me. Grandma Maggie taught me that family isn't just about who you're born to, she read to me from her draft. It's about who chooses to love you, who shows up for you, who fights for you even when it's difficult. She taught me that love isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes love is quiet and patient and steady, the kind of love that waits years for the chance to be recognized. As I listened to her read, I thought about Robert's final gift to me. Not the money or the cabin or the legal recognition, but this. A granddaughter who understands what real love looks like, who knows that the most important relationships in life are built not on obligation, but on choice. Robert kept his promise after all. He made sure marriage didn't change our relationship. It took him 28 years and a legal document written from beyond the grave, but he made sure I knew that I had been his real mother, that I mattered, that the love between us was worth fighting for. Sometimes I sit on the dock at the cabin, watching the sunset over the lake, and I can almost feel him there beside me. The little boy who walked me down the aisle, who promised me that we'd always be family, who kept that promise in the only way he knew how. My daughter-in-law said I wasn't family, but my son made sure the whole world knew better. And sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes, love finds a way to win in the end.